Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Roberto Assagioli, the architect of psychosynthesis and champion of the higher self. Together and apart, they mapped the upward reaches of human consciousness, each finding in the depths of psyche a doorway to transcendence. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approached the spiritual dimension of psychology. One, seeing the self emerging through the reconciliation of opposites and the slow work of individuation. The other, discovering a luminous superconscious realm, accessible through disciplined inner practice and the cultivation of will. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Assagioli as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. The story begins, as so many stories of the soul do, in Europe at the turn of the 20th century, when the mystery of consciousness was being pried open by new and daring minds. The Victorian certainties were crumbling. Freud had already lit a torch in the darkness of the unconscious, showing that beneath the respectable surface of civilized life churned desires and memories too troubling for daylight. The parlors of Vienna buzzed with talk of dreams, slips of the tongue, childhood traumas. Psychology was young, rebellious, intoxicated with its own discoveries. In this ferment, two men were coming of age, separated by geography and temperament, yet destined to travel parallel roads toward the heights of human potential. Carl Jung, born in 1875 in the Swiss countryside, grew up haunted by dreams and visions, the son of a pastor whose faith seemed hollow and a mother whose personality split mysteriously in two. From childhood, Jung sensed that the world contained more than what could be seen, that beneath the ordinary surface ran currents of meaning and symbol. He would spend his youth torn between the scientific materialism of his medical studies and the numinous experiences that visited him in solitude. Roberto Assagioli entered the world 13 years later, in 1888, born into a Jewish family in Venice that would soon move to Florence. If Jung's Switzerland was a land of mountains, lakes, and Protestant restraint, Assagioli's Italy was all sun-drenched stone, Renaissance art, and Catholic mysticism blended with the secular humanism of Italian culture. Where Jung would be shaped by German philosophy and the stern heritage of Reformed Christianity, Assagioli grew up surrounded by Dante's poetry, the paintings of Fra Angelico, the lingering sense that beauty and divinity were inseparable. Italy itself seemed to teach that the spirit could be made visible, that transcendence could take form in marble and fresco. The young Assagioli was brilliant, sensitive, and drawn to the life of the mind. His family encouraged his intellectual gifts, and he proved an exceptional student, devouring books with a hunger that went beyond mere scholarship. There was in him, from early on, a quality of spiritual seeking, where some young men of his generation embrace the materialism of the age, or the cynicism that comes from seeing through old, religious forms. Assagioli felt certain that human beings were meant for something higher, that consciousness contained unexplored dimensions waiting to be mapped and cultivated. He was, in temperament, an optimist of the spirit, someone who looked at human nature and saw not just the darkness Freud was excavating, but the potential for light. Meanwhile, Jung was beginning his medical career, training in psychiatry at the Bergholzli Hospital in Zurich under Eugen Bleuler. The hospital was a world unto itself, filled with patients whose minds had broken in various ways, schizophrenics lost in private symbolic universes, depressives sunk in wells of despair, hysterics whose bodies spoke what their mouths could not. Jung worked with word association tests, measuring how patients responded to emotionally charged words, discovering what he would call complexes, those autonomous clusters of feeling and memory that seemed to possess a life of their own within the psyche. He was discovering that the mind was not the unified rational thing philosophers had imagined, but a parliament of voices, a multiplicity. In 1907, Jung met Sigmund Freud, and for several years became the favored son of psychoanalysis, the brilliant Swiss Protestant who would carry Freud's Jewish-Viennese insights into the broader world. But the relationship contained from the beginning the seeds of rupture. Jung could not accept Freud's insistence that everything in the psyche reduced to sexuality. Jung's dreams and visions, his studies of mythology and religion, his own inner experiences, all of these pointed toward a spiritual dimension that Freud's theory could not accommodate. When the break came in 1913, it was not just intellectual, but deeply personal. A wounding that sent Jung into several years of what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, a voluntary descent into the darkest and most luminous regions of his own psyche. During these years, 1913 to 1917, Jung experienced visions, heard voices, engaged in active imagination with figures that emerged from within him. He painted, he wrote, he allowed the unconscious to speak in its own symbolic language. This was the crucible from which his mature psychology would emerge, a psychology that honored the unconscious, not as a mere repository of repressed wishes, but as a source of wisdom, creativity, and spiritual insight. Jung came to believe that the unconscious contained not just the personal debris of one's own forgotten past, but a collective layer, shared by all humanity, populated by universal patterns he called archetypes. And at the center of this inner cosmos was the self, the archetype of wholeness, the organizing principle that directed the process. Jung called individuation the lifelong journey toward becoming fully oneself. While Jung was undergoing his dark night of the soul, Assagioli was pursuing his own intellectual journey. He earned a medical degree from the University of Florence in 1910, writing his thesis on psychoanalysis, one of the earliest dissertations on Freud's new psychology in Italy. Assagioli had read Freud with fascination and respect, recognizing the revolutionary importance of the unconscious. But like Jung, he felt that Freud's vision was incomplete. Where Freud saw neurosis as the result of repressed instincts, Assagioli saw it also as the result of repressed higher aspirations. Where Freud found only the id beneath consciousness, Assagioli intuited a superconscious realm above it, a dimension of higher values, aesthetic experience, ethical impulses, and spiritual intuitions. Assagioli began reading widely beyond the psychoanalytic literature. He explored the philosophy of Henri Bergson, with its emphasis on creative evolution and the élan vital, the life force that pushes existence toward greater complexity and consciousness. He studied William, James, the American psychologist philosopher who took religious experience seriously as psychological data and who described the varieties of mystical states with sympathy and precision. He read the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, drawn to Eastern spiritual traditions that mapped states of consciousness Western psychology barely acknowledged. He discovered the writings of Alice Bailey and the Theosophical Society, with their ambitious attempts to synthesize Eastern and Western esotericism into a coherent spiritual psychology. And he encountered the work of Jung. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly when Assagioli first encountered Jung's ideas, but it was likely in the years following Jung's break with Freud, as Jung's distinctive approach to psychology began to crystallize and find its audience. Assagioli read Jung's Psychological Types, published in 1921, with its intricate exploration of introversion and extroversion and its insistence that libido was not merely sexual energy, but general psychic energy that could take many forms. He read Jung's explorations of symbolism, his studies of alchemy, his conviction that the psyche possessed a religious function and that neurosis often stemmed from a spiritual crisis. In Jung, Assagioli found a kindred spirit, someone who had also broken with Freud over the question of spirituality, someone who took seriously the higher reaches of human consciousness, someone who believed that the goal of psychological work was not merely adaptation to society, but the realization of one's deepest potential. Jung had given a name to the organizing center of the psyche, the self, distinct from the ego, a transpersonal principle that guided development from within. Assagioli recognized in this concept something essential, though he would develop it in his own direction. The two men met at least once, in 1907, at the First International Congress of Psychiatry and Neurology in Amsterdam, though Jung at that time was still within Freud's orbit and had not yet developed his mature psychology. Years later, their paths would cross again in the realm of ideas. Assagioli sent Jung copies of his papers and his 1927 book, Psychologia e Spiritualità, which outlined the principles of what he was beginning to call psychosynthesis. Jung responded cordially, acknowledging the overlap in their thinking while noting, with characteristic Swiss precision, the differences in emphasis and method. They maintained a respectful, if distant professional relationship, more colleagues in a shared endeavor than close collaborators. Both men, by the 1920s and 30s, were developing comprehensive psychologies that included the spiritual dimension, a bold move in an era when psychology was trying to establish itself as a rigorous science, which often meant excluding subjective experiences like mystical states or moral intuitions as too vague or culturally specific to study systematically. Jung and Assagioli both rejected this narrowing of psychology's domain. They insisted that one could not understand the human psyche without accounting for its religious and spiritual dimensions, that the experiences reported by mystics and meditators were not pathological aberrations, but data points revealing capacities inherent in consciousness itself. Yet their approaches, even as they aimed at similar horizons, diverged in significant ways from the beginning. Jung, scarred by his own descent into the unconscious and by the rupture with Freud, became something of a cautious explorer. He developed a method, active imagination, dream analysis, amplification through mythology and comparative religion, designed to let the unconscious reveal itself in its own symbolic language. Jung believed that the psyche had its own wisdom, that one could not force or direct the process of individuation, but only create conditions for it to unfold. He was wary of anything that smacked of spiritual inflation, the danger of the ego identifying with archetypal energies and losing its grounding. He emphasized the tension of opposites, the necessity of holding consciousness and unconsciousness, light and shadow, in dynamic balance. For Jung, the self emerged not through ascent but through integration, through bringing together what had been split. Assagioli, by contrast, was a spiritual optimist with a teacher's gift for method. He believed that spiritual development could be actively cultivated through specific practices and techniques. Where Jung saw the psyche as a wilderness to be respected and carefully navigated, Assagioli saw it as a territory that could be mapped, climbed, and harmonized through conscious effort. His model of the psyche included not only a lower unconscious, roughly equivalent to Freud's repressed material, and a middle unconscious of the ordinary flow of psychological life, but also a higher unconscious or superconscious, a realm of higher intuitions, aspirations, and potentials. At the crown of this inner architecture was the higher self, the transpersonal center of identity, the part of us that is connected to universal consciousness. Psychosynthesis, the approach Assagioli spent decades developing, was both a psychology and a spiritual path. It included techniques for working with what he called subpersonalities, those semi-autonomous parts of ourselves that Jung might have called complexes, helping them to dialogue, to integrate, to serve the whole personality rather than pulling it in conflicting directions. It emphasized the training of the will, not as repressive control, but as the capacity to direct one's energies in alignment with one's deepest values and highest aspirations. It used guided visualizations, meditative practices, and imaginative exercises to help individuals access the superconscious realm and bring its qualities, serenity, love, courage, joy, into everyday life. Where Jung's method was largely receptive, allowing symbols to emerge spontaneously from the unconscious and then working to understand their meaning, Assagioli's method was more directive, guiding consciousness systematically toward higher states. Where Jung emphasized the importance of suffering, of sitting with the tension of opposites until a third thing emerged, Assagioli emphasized the cultivation of positive qualities and the deliberate expansion of consciousness. Jung's path was cruciform, a descent into darkness and an ascent into light held together in paradox. Assagioli's path was more like a ladder, a series of stages and practices leading upward toward transpersonal realization. Both men were products of their times and their cultures. Jung's psychology bore the marks of Protestant interiority, German philosophical idealism, and the Swiss respect for careful empirical observation even in matters of the soul. Assagioli's psychosynthesis reflected Italian humanism, the Catholic emphasis on the saints as models of human potential, the aesthetic tradition that saw beauty as a pathway to the divine, and an eclectic openness to spiritual traditions from around the world that was perhaps easier in Italy, with its history of trade and cultural exchange, than in landlocked Switzerland. As the years passed and both men's work became better known, they attracted different kinds of followers. Jung's students were often drawn to depth, to the careful work of making the unconscious conscious, to the patient deciphering of dreams and symbols. They were willing to live with uncertainty, with the recognition that the psyche contains much that remains forever mysterious. Assagioli's students were often seekers and idealists, people drawn to the promise of spiritual development, to the idea that with the right practices one could cultivate compassion, wisdom, and transpersonal awareness. They wanted methods, practices, steps, a path that could be followed. Yet, beneath these differences in style and emphasis, Both men shared certain fundamental convictions. They both believed that human beings are not merely biological organisms driven by instinct and shaped by conditioning, but spiritual beings on a journey of becoming. They both saw the psyche as containing higher potentials waiting to be realized. They both understood that healing and growth required attending not just to what was wrong, the neurotic symptoms, the childhood wounds, but to what wanted to emerge, the unlived possibilities, the seed of wholeness seeking to sprout. They both believed that the ego, the conscious sense of I, was not the center of the personality, but needed to be brought into right relationship with a larger self. They both saw psychological work as ultimately a spiritual discipline, a path toward what Assagioli called self-realization and Jung called individuation. The dialogue between these two approaches Jung's depth psychological and Assagioli's. Psychosynthetic is a dialogue between different visions of spiritual development, different understandings of how consciousness grows. It is a conversation that continues today, as practitioners draw on both traditions, as spiritual seekers find themselves drawn now to one approach, now to the other, depending on where they are in their own journeys. To understand this dialogue more deeply, to hear the harmonies and the tensions, we need to descend into the details of their thinking, to see how each understood the structures of the psyche, the methods of transformation, the goal of the journey. We need to place them side by side, these two architects of consciousness, and watch how their designs both overlap and diverge. The architecture of the psyche, as both Jung and Assagioli understood it, is vastly more complex than Freud's relatively simple trinity of id, ego, and superego. Both men intuited that consciousness has levels, layers, regions with different characteristics and different contents. But the maps they drew, while similar in acknowledging vertical dimension, differed in emphasis and detail. Jung's model of the psyche is perhaps best visualized as a series of concentric circles or nested spheres. At the center is the ego, the complex of consciousness that says I. The ego is necessary. It's what gives continuity to experience, what makes decision and intentional action possible. But the ego is small, a relatively recent evolutionary development, and it floats on a much larger sea of unconsciousness. Surrounding and underlying the ego is the personal unconscious, containing all the experiences, memories, and feelings that have been forgotten, repressed, or never made it to conscious awareness. Within the personal unconscious are the complexes, those emotionally charged clusters of associations that can be activated by triggers in the present, causing us to react with unexpected intensity. A complex might form around a childhood wound, a cultural assumption, an unintegrated aspect of identity. When a complex is activated, it temporarily seizes consciousness, and we become, in a sense, possessed by it, reacting automatically rather than responding consciously. But beneath the personal unconscious lies something deeper and more mysterious, the collective unconscious. This is Jung's most distinctive contribution, the idea that has been most misunderstood and most generative. The collective unconscious is not acquired through personal experience, but is inherited, the psychic equivalent of our biological structure. Just as we all have hearts and lungs and nervous systems organized in fundamentally similar ways, we all have psyches structured around the same fundamental patterns. These patterns Jung called archetypes. The archetypes are not specific images or ideas, but are better thought of as organizing principles, forms, waiting to be filled with content. The mother archetype, for instance, is not any particular mother or even the concept of motherhood, but the pattern around which all experiences of mothering and being mothered organize themselves. It manifests in dreams as the good mother, the terrible mother, the earth mother, in myths as Demeter or Mary or Kali, in life as the complex feelings we have toward our own mothers and the way we mother or are drawn to be mothered by others. Jung identified many archetypes, the shadow, which contains the aspects of ourselves we reject and project onto others, the anima and animus, the contrasexual aspects of psyche that mediate between consciousness and the unconscious, the wise old man and the great mother, the trickster, the divine child. Each archetype, when encountered in dreams, visions, or outer life, carries numinous power, a sense of meaning and significance beyond the personal. And at the center of this archetypal realm, both the source and the goal of development is the self. The self, in Jung's psychology, is the archetype of wholeness, the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious. It is the organizing principle that guides development throughout life, the attractor toward which the process of individuation moves. The self is paradoxical. It is both the center and the circumference, both deeply personal and transpersonal. It is experienced as a power greater than the ego, sometimes as an inner voice or guiding presence, sometimes in symbols of totality like mandalas, sometimes in religious experience as God or the divine ground of being. Jung was careful to distinguish between the self as archetype and the ego as the center of consciousness. One of the most dangerous pitfalls on the spiritual path, he believed, was inflation, the ego identifying with the self, thinking, I am God, rather than recognizing there is something divine in me that is more than I. True individuation requires the ego to maintain its boundaries and functions while coming into right relationship with the self, serving it, without being dissolved by it. The process of individuation, as Jung understood it, is not a straight ascent but a circling spiral, a progressive integration of contents from the unconscious into consciousness. It typically begins in midlife, when the goals and identities of the first half of life, career, family, social position no longer satisfy, and a person begins to ask deeper questions. Who am I really? What is my life's meaning? What have I neglected or sacrificed in becoming who I thought I should be? Individuation proceeds through a series of encounters with archetypal figures. One must face the shadow, acknowledging and integrating the rejected and despised parts of oneself. One must differentiate from the persona, the social mask we wear, recognizing that we are more than our roles and reputations. One must encounter the contrasexual other within the anima or animus, and come to terms with the rejected qualities associated with the other gender. And eventually, if the work goes deep enough, one encounters the self, experiences moments of wholeness, glimpses of the person one is meant to become. Jung emphasized that this process could not be rushed or forced. The unconscious has its own timing, its own wisdom. The work of the analyst, the work of the individual, was to create the conditions: psychological safety, ethical seriousness, openness to the symbolic in which the unconscious could reveal itself. The primary methods were dream work, active imagination, and what Jung called amplification, placing one's personal symbols in dialogue with the vast repertoire of human myth, religion, and culture to discern their archetypal meanings. Assagioli's map of the psyche shares some of Jung's intuitions, but organizes them differently and adds elements that reflect his more optimistic and practical orientation. Where Jung's model is primarily horizontal, distinguishing between personal and collective layers, Assagioli's model is explicitly vertical, mapping the psyche along an axis from lower to higher consciousness. At the bottom of Assagioli's diagram of the psyche, and he loved diagrams, being more systematic and pedagogical than Jung, is the lower unconscious. This contains the repressed material Freud focused on, the primitive drives and traumatic memories, but also what we might call the biological unconscious, the automatic functions that keep the body working. The lower unconscious is not evil, but it is dense, heavy, the realm of instinct and unprocessed material. In the middle is the middle unconscious, equivalent to what we might call the preconscious, the thoughts, feelings, and memories that are not currently in awareness but can easily be recalled. This is the realm of everyday psychological life. Skills we've learned, knowledge we've acquired, the ordinary flow of mental activity. But here's where Assagioli's model diverges dramatically from Freud, and even from Jung's explicit formulations. Above the middle unconscious, he places the higher unconscious or superconscious. This is the realm of higher intuitions and inspirations, of aesthetic, ethical, and spiritual experiences, of latent potentials for compassion, wisdom, courage, and joy. The superconscious is the source of what is best in us, the repository of our highest aspirations. It is as unconscious as the lower unconscious. We do not have immediate access to it, but its qualities and contents are the opposite. Where the lower unconscious is dark, the superconscious is luminous. Where the lower pulls toward density and regression, the superconscious draws toward expansion and transcendence. At the center of normal waking consciousness is the field of consciousness, within which is the conscious self, or I, the immediate sense of personal identity and awareness. This is roughly equivalent to Jung's ego, the subject that says I am, that chooses and acts and observes. But rising above the field of consciousness, at the apex of the superconscious, Assagioli places the higher self, the transpersonal self. This is the spiritual core of the person, the permanent center of identity, the part of us that is unchanging while the personality changes, the part that is connected to universal consciousness, to what some traditions call the divine or the absolute. The higher self is both immanent and transcendent. It is our deepest identity, yet it is more than our individual self. It is the source of inspiration, of moments of illumination, of the sense of connection to something greater. Between the conscious self and the higher self, Assagioli draws a dotted line, suggesting that these are not ultimately separate but appear separate from the perspective of ordinary consciousness. The goal of psychosynthesis is to make this connection conscious and stable, to align the personal self with the higher self, to bring the wisdom and energies of the superconscious into everyday life. Surrounding the entire structure, Assagioli places the collective unconscious, acknowledging Jung's contribution and the reality that we are embedded in a larger matrix of shared patterns and potentials. But for Assagioli, the focus is less on exploring this collective dimension and more on the vertical journey from lower to middle to higher consciousness. Where Jung saw the psyche as needing integration of opposites, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, held in creative tension, Assagioli saw the psyche as needing synthesis, the harmonization of parts under the guidance of the higher self. Where Jung was drawn to the paradoxical, to the coincidentia oppositorum, the union of opposites, Assagioli was drawn to the hierarchical, to the organization of multiplicity into unity. This difference is reflected in how each understood pathology and healing. For Jung, neurosis often resulted from one-sidedness, from the ego identifying too completely with one archetypal pattern or one set of values, leaving its opposite relegated to the shadow, where it festers and erupts in symptoms or destructive behavior. The neurotic extrovert who has repressed his introverted side, the intellectual who has cut off from feeling, the person who has constructed a perfect persona at the cost of losing touch with his authentic self, all suffer from this splitting. Healing requires recognizing and integrating what has been rejected. Assagioli certainly recognized the problems caused by repression and one-sidedness, but he added another dimension, what he called repression of the sublime. Sometimes, he argued, people suffer not because they have repressed their lower instincts, but because they have repressed their higher aspirations. The artist who has abandoned her creativity to pursue a conventional career, the idealist who has become cynical, the spiritual seeker who has shut down mystical experiences for fear of being thought strange. These people are neurotic not because of what lurks in their basement, but because of what is locked in their attic. They need not only to integrate the shadow, but to open to the superconscious, to give voice and form to the higher potentials seeking expression. This insight led Assagioli to develop techniques quite different from Jung's, though complementary. Where Jung practiced active imagination, a kind of meditation in which one allows figures from the unconscious to appear and interact with consciousness, observing them and dialoguing with them without directing what happens, Assagioli developed guided visualizations with specific aims. He would lead people to imagine themselves climbing a mountain toward a temple of silence, or to visualize themselves in a rose garden where each rose represents a quality they want to cultivate, or to imagine meeting a wise being who offers guidance. These techniques were not random fantasies, but carefully structured practices designed to help people access the superconscious, to invoke qualities of higher consciousness and stabilize them in awareness. Where Jung waited for the unconscious to send its messages, Assagioli actively invited consciousness to ascend. A central technique in psychosynthesis is what Assagioli called disidentification and self-identification. The practice begins with a simple but profound observation. I am not my body, though I have a body. I am not my emotions, though I experience emotions. I am not my thoughts, though I think thoughts. I am not my roles, though I play many roles. By systematically disidentifying from the contents of consciousness, the person comes to rest in the observing center, the I that has experiences but is not identified with any particular experience. From this center of pure self-awareness, one can then reach toward the higher self, recognizing a deeper identity beyond the personality. This is quite different from Jung's approach, which was less about achieving a state of pure witnessing consciousness and more about deepening the relationship between ego and unconscious through symbolic engagement. Jung would have been suspicious of any practice that encouraged disconnection from the contents of the psyche, even temporarily, fearing it could lead to spiritual inflation or dissociation. He believed you had to go through the material, not rise above it. But Assagioli was not trying to escape the psyche's contents. Rather, he was trying to find the center from which those contents could be organized and harmonized. His work with subpersonalities illustrates this. He observed that each of us contains multiple selves: the critic, the pleaser, the rebel, the caretaker, the perfectionist, each with its own feelings, thoughts, and agendas. These subpersonalities often conflict, pulling us in different directions, making us feel fragmented. The goal is not to eliminate them, but to bring them into dialogue, to understand their needs and fears, and to coordinate them under the leadership of the conscious self in service of the higher self. Jung had a parallel concept in his notion of complexes, but he treated them more as autonomous entities to be recognized and related to, than as parts that could be actively synthesized. A complex, for Jung, always retains some autonomy. You can never fully integrate it, only develop a more conscious relationship with it. Assagioli, with his emphasis on will and synthesis, believed that these parts could be brought into harmony, that the personality could become unified. The will, for Assagioli, was a central concept, one that has no real equivalent in Jung's psychology. Assagioli distinguished among several types of will: the strong will, the capacity to persist and overcome obstacles; the skillful will, the ability to choose wisely and act effectively; the good will, which is aligned with higher values; and ultimately, the transpersonal will, which is the will of the higher self, expressing itself through the personality. Developing the will was not about control or repression, but about learning to direct one's energies intentionally, to make choices aligned with one's deepest values and highest aspirations. Jung, by contrast, was wary of the will. He had seen too many people try to will themselves into wholeness, to force spiritual experiences, to use psychological techniques as a form of spiritual ambition. He believed that the ego's willfulness was often the problem, not the solution, that one needed to learn a kind of active receptivity, a willingness to be shaped by the self rather than to shape oneself. This difference reflects their different relationships to spiritual traditions. Jung, though deeply versed in Christian mysticism, alchemy, and Eastern philosophy, remained fundamentally a psychologist who studied religion as a psychological phenomenon. He bracketed the question of whether God exists metaphysically, focusing instead on the psychological, the reality of the God image, the experience of the numinous. He was cautious about spiritual practice, aware of how easily it can become an escape from psychological work, how the light of the superconscious can blind one to the necessary work with the shadow. Assagioli, on the other hand, was a spiritual practitioner as much as a psychologist. He meditated daily, studied with spiritual teachers, and saw psychosynthesis as a Western yoga, a practical path towards self-realization. He drew on Buddhist meditation practices, on Raja Yoga with its systematic cultivation of mental powers, on Christian contemplative prayer. He was comfortable blending these traditions in a way that Jung, with his deep respect for the integrity of each tradition, was not. Jung insisted that Westerners needed to find their way through Western symbols and Western spiritual traditions. He was critical of Westerners who took up Eastern practices without doing the psychological work necessary to integrate them, warning that this often led to inflation or a kind of spiritual bypassing, using transcendence to avoid personal issues. When he traveled to India and was offered initiation by a guru, he declined, saying that he needed to understand his own Western psyche first. Assagioli had no such hesitations. He saw wisdom traditions from around the world as a great treasury from which to draw different paths up the same mountain. His eclecticism was both a strength and a potential weakness. It allowed him to integrate insights from many sources, but it sometimes lacked the depth and rootedness that comes from dwelling within a single tradition. Their different attitudes towards spiritual emergency also reveal their different approaches. Jung wrote about the dangers of the unleashed unconscious, the psychotic break that can occur when archetypal energies overwhelm the ego. He had lived through his own near-psychotic episode during his confrontation with the unconscious, and he knew how thin the line was between mystical experience and madness. He emphasized the need for containment, for a strong enough ego to withstand the encounter with the numinous, for ethical discipline and psychological grounding. Assagioli acknowledged these dangers, but was more optimistic about what he called crises of spiritual awakening. He described cases where people undergoing intense spiritual experiences, spontaneous mystical states, kundalini awakenings, openings to transpersonal realms were misdiagnosed as psychotic, when in fact they were experiencing the sometimes difficult emergence of superconscious content. He developed methods for helping people integrate these experiences, for supporting the process rather than suppressing it with medication. His approach was less cautious than Jung's, more welcoming of the eruption of higher consciousness. In their views of suffering, too, we see different emphases. Jung saw suffering as intrinsic to the individuation process, the necessary crucible in which transformation occurs. He wrote about the importance of holding the tension of opposites, of not prematurely resolving contradictions, of sitting with anxiety, depression, and meaninglessness until a third thing emerges from the unconscious that transcends the conflict. His was a tragic vision in some sense, acknowledging that wholeness includes brokenness, that the self contains both light and dark. Assagioli did not deny the reality of suffering, but his emphasis was on transcending it through accessing higher states of consciousness. He taught techniques for evoking serenity, joy, and love even in the midst of difficult circumstances, for connecting with the higher self, which stands above the conflicts of the personality. His was a more hopeful vision, suggesting that suffering, while real, need not be the final word, that consciousness can ascend beyond the pairs of opposites into a realm of peace. These differences are perhaps most visible in their respective approaches to spiritual practice. Jung did not prescribe practices. His method was tailored to the individual. One person might be guided to paint their dreams, another to study a particular alchemical text, another to pay attention to synchronicities. The work was slow, idiosyncratic, meandering, following the thread of the individual's unique symbols and experiences. Assagioli, by contrast, developed a whole curriculum of psychosynthetic practices that could be taught systematically. There were exercises for strengthening the will, exercises for evoking specific qualities like courage or compassion, exercises for working with subpersonalities, exercises for accessing the superconscious. One could study psychosynthesis in a structured way, progressing through stages of personal and then transpersonal psychosynthesis. It was more like learning a discipline than undergoing a process. Yet for all these differences, when we place Jung and Assagioli side by side, we see two men grappling with the same essential mystery: the fact that human consciousness is not a fixed thing, but a spectrum, a territory with many regions, and that most people live in only a small portion of that territory. Both believed that buried in the psyche are potentials for wisdom, compassion, creativity, and connection to something larger than the individual ego. Both saw psychological work as a sacred endeavor, not merely the treatment of illness, but the cultivation of wholeness. Both challenged the materialism of their age, insisting that the spiritual dimension is real, important, and accessible through disciplined inner work. If we imagine Jung and Assagioli in dialogue, we might hear Jung caution Assagioli about the dangers of spiritual ambition, the risk of inflating the ego by identifying with the higher self, the importance of attending to the shadow even as one reaches toward the light. Jung might worry that Assagioli's techniques, for all their beauty and practical utility, could become a way of bypassing the difficult work of integration, of leaping toward transcendence without first establishing a solid foundation in the personal unconscious. And we might hear Assagioli reply that Jung's method, for all its depth and rigor, can be too slow, too cautious, too focused on pathology and shadow. Why? Assagioli might ask. Should we dwell so long in the darkness when the light is available? Why not give people practices that help them access higher states of consciousness, that evoke the qualities they want to embody, that connect them with their higher self and its wisdom? Is there not a risk in Jung's approach of getting stuck in analysis, of endlessly circling one's complexes without ever breaking through to transformation? Both would be right. The tension between their approaches is not a problem to be solved, but a creative polarity to be held. Two necessary movements in the dance of consciousness, the descent into depth and the ascent toward height, the integration of shadow and the invocation of light, the patient tending of symbols and the active cultivation of states, the honoring of the unconscious as autonomy and the exercise of conscious will. In the lived experience of psychological and spiritual development, most people need both movements at different times. There are seasons when we must descend, when we must face what we have avoided, when we must sit with our depression, our anxiety, our shame, allowing the unconscious to reveal what we need to see, as Jung taught. And there are seasons when we must ascend, when we must consciously reach toward our higher potentials, practice compassion and courage, connect with sources of inspiration and guidance, as Assagioli taught. The danger in the Jungian approach is getting lost in the labyrinth of the psyche, becoming fascinated by one's own complexity, using self-reflection as a form of narcissism, never moving from insight to embodiment. The danger in the psychosynthetic approach is spiritual bypassing, reaching for the heights before establishing depth, using light to avoid shadow, achieving temporary states without transforming structure. But when the two approaches are held together, when depth and height inform each other, we have something approaching a complete psychology of consciousness. We need Jung's respect for the unconscious autonomy, his insistence on facing the shadow, his subtle understanding of symbols and archetypes, his caution against inflation. And we need Assagioli's techniques for accessing higher consciousness, his systematic approach to will and synthesis, his optimism about human potential, his recognition that the superconscious is as real and important as the unconscious. Perhaps the deepest difference between them concerns their understanding of the self. For Jung, the self is the totality of the psyche, the union of all opposites, light and dark, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective. It is not essentially good or bad, but is beyond such categories, containing everything. The experience of the self is numinous, overwhelming, often paradoxical and terrifying as well as blissful. The self demands individuation, the differentiation and development of the individual personality in all its uniqueness, even when this conflicts with collective norms. For Assagioli, the higher self is fundamentally good, wise, and loving. It is the divine spark within, the part of us that is one with universal consciousness. The higher self does not contain opposites, but transcends them. The experience of the higher self is characterized by peace, joy, love, a sense of rightness and harmony. The higher self guides us towards self-realization, the flowering of our highest potentials, the embodiment of transpersonal values like truth, beauty, and goodness. These are not contradictory so much as emphasizing different aspects of the same reality. Jung speaks from the perspective of one who has wrestled with the dark side of the numinous, who knows that the encounter with the divine can shatter as well as heal, that the self demands sacrifice and transformation. Assagioli speaks from the perspective of one who has tasted the bliss of higher consciousness and wants to make this accessible to others, to provide a path upward toward the light. In practice, many therapists and teachers today draw on both traditions, using Jungian approaches to work with dreams, symbols, and shadow material, and psychosynthetic approaches to help clients access resources, develop the will, and connect with their higher potentials. The rigid boundaries between schools of thought have softened, and there is a growing recognition that different methods serve different needs and different moments in the journey. The dialogue between Jung and Assagioli is part of a larger conversation in psychology and spirituality about how to understand and work with the full spectrum of human consciousness. It is a conversation that includes many voices: the behavioral psychologists who focus on observable behavior and learned patterns, the cognitive psychologists who study how thinking shapes experience, the humanistic psychologists who emphasize growth and self-actualization, the transpersonal psychologists who study mystical and peak experiences, the contemplative traditions of East and West that have mapped states of consciousness for millennia. What Jung and Assagioli share, and what distinguishes them from more reductionist approaches, is the conviction that consciousness is not merely an epiphenomenon of brain activity, not merely a tool for survival and reproduction, but is in some sense primary, fundamental to the nature of reality itself. Both believed that the psyche is a cosmos unto itself, with its own patterns, energies, and intelligences, and that by exploring this inner cosmos we touch something universal, something that connects us to the fabric of existence. In the silence of meditation or the depths of dream work, in moments of inspiration or experiences of awe, the boundary between self and self, between personal and transpersonal, becomes permeable. These are the moments both Jung and Assagioli pointed toward, though they approach them differently. Jung would have us attend to these moments, amplify them through study of myth and symbol, integrate them carefully into the fabric of our lives. Assagioli would have us cultivate these moments through practice, stabilize them through discipline, allow them to transform our personality from within. As we drift now deeper into the territory of reflection, let us consider what these two visions together reveal about the nature of consciousness and the journey toward wholeness. Let us allow their dialogue to open questions that have no final answers, but that, in the asking, illuminate what it means to be human, to be a center of awareness seeking to understand and realize itself. The most profound gift that both Jung and Assagioli offer us is a more spacious understanding of what we are. In the materialist worldview that still dominates much of modern culture, we are sophisticated machines, the products of genes and conditioning, pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain, building civilizations and creating art as elaborate expressions of our need to survive and reproduce. There is truth in this view, but it captures only a thin slice of human experience. It does not account for the mystic absorbed in contemplation, the artist who sacrifices everything for beauty, the martyr who dies for a principle, the moment of grace when the heart opens and the world is transfigured. Jung and Assagioli both insisted that we are much more than the materialist account suggests. We are not merely organisms, but psyches, centers of subjective experience and meaning. We are not merely individual, but participants in something larger, a collective unconscious, a universal consciousness, a field of intelligence and creativity that precedes and exceeds any individual mind. We are not merely the product of our past, but are oriented toward a future, pulled forward by potentials seeking realization, by a self that wants to become conscious, by a telos or purpose inherent in our being. This understanding has radical implications. It means that the meaning we seek is not something we must construct from nothing, imposing our will on an indifferent universe, but is something we can discover, something woven into the fabric of our psychic life. It means that the feelings of alienation and emptiness that plague modern life are not intrinsic to the human condition, but are symptoms of disconnection from the deeper layers of psyche, from the unconscious and superconscious realms that ground and inspire us. Jung called the characteristic malady of modern consciousness one-sidedness, the hypertrophy of rational ego consciousness at the expense of the symbolic, the emotional, the instinctual, and the spiritual dimensions of life. We have become identified with a narrow band of awareness, the thinking, planning, controlling part of ourselves, and have lost touch with the other 90% of the psyche. The result is neurosis, meaninglessness, a sense that life is hollow even when outwardly successful. Assagioli framed the problem slightly differently. He spoke of disintegration and lack of synthesis, the sense of being pulled in multiple directions by conflicting drives and demands, of being a house divided against itself. Without a center, without connection to the higher self, we are fragmented, reactive, tossed about by circumstances. We identify with our emotions, our roles, our thoughts, never resting in the stable core of being from which we might act with wisdom and purpose. Both diagnoses ring true, and both point toward healing through reconnection with the unconscious for Jung, reconnection with the higher self for Assagioli. But the path of reconnection is not a return to some pre-rational state of fusion or innocence. It is a spiraling upward and downward that includes and transcends rationality, a development that Jung called individuation and Assagioli called psychosynthesis. Individuation, in Jung's understanding, is the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, an indivisible whole, distinguishing themselves from the collective and from identification with any particular complex or archetype. It is a process that typically begins in earnest in the second half of life, though its seeds are present earlier. The first half of life is necessarily focused on adaptation, developing skills, forming relationships, building a career, contributing to society. We construct a persona, a social face, and we develop the functions and attitudes that serve our adaptation. For some people, this is enough, and they live satisfying lives without ever questioning the identity they have constructed. But for others, typically around midlife, cracks appear. The goals that once motivated us lose their luster. The relationships that once sustained us feel constraining. The work that once defined us seems empty. Dreams become more vivid and troubling. Moods and symptoms that we thought we'd left behind in youth return with new force. We feel restless, dissatisfied, haunted by a sense that something essential has been neglected. This is the call to individuation, the psyche's demand that we attend to what has been left out. The shadow, all the qualities and potentials we rejected in order to become acceptable to ourselves and others, starts knocking at the door. The contrasexual other within, the anima or animus, appears in dreams or is projected onto people in our lives, drawing us into relationships and experiences that force us to face unfamiliar parts of ourselves. The self begins to constellate, appearing in dreams as images of wholeness, guiding figures, or mandalas. Jung described this process not as a smooth ascent, but as a series of deaths and rebirths, of dissolutions and reintegrations. One must die to an old identity to be reborn to a larger one. One must sacrifice cherished ideas about who one is to allow a more comprehensive sense of self to emerge. This is painful, disorienting work. It often feels like things are falling apart when in fact they are falling together in a new and more authentic configuration. The method Jung developed for this work is centered on attending to the messages of the unconscious, primarily through dreams, but also through fantasies, symptoms, and synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that suggest a connection between inner and outer worlds. Dreams, for Jung, are not mere random firings of neurons or disguised wish fulfillments, but are purposive communications from the unconscious, compensating the one-sidedness of consciousness, pointing toward what needs attention, revealing potentials and dangers. To work with a dream in a Jungian way is to enter into relationship with it, to amplify its images through association and mythological parallels, to feel into the emotional tone, to ask what aspect of consciousness it is compensating. A dream of being chased by a dark figure might represent the shadow pursuing the ego, demanding recognition. A dream of crossing a threshold into a sacred space might indicate an initiation, a movement toward the self. The work is not to decode the dream into a fixed meaning, but to allow it to resonate, to let it work on consciousness the way a poem or a piece of music works, opening new dimensions of awareness. Active imagination, another of Jung's key methods, takes this further. In active imagination, one consciously invokes a figure from the unconscious, a dream character, an inner voice, a personification of an emotion or quality, and engages in dialogue with it. The key is to enter the imaginative space fully, while maintaining the ego as a witness and participant. It is not daydreaming, where the ego dissolves and you lose yourself in fantasy, nor is it thinking about the figure, but a kind of waking dream in which you encounter the figure as genuinely other, listen to what it says, respond, and allow a relationship to develop. Jung's own active imaginations, recorded in the Red Book, show this process in its rawest form. He encountered figures like Philemon, an old man with kingfisher wings, who taught him that thoughts are living beings with their own autonomy, and Salome, a blind woman who represented the anima, the soul guide, into the unconscious. These figures challenged Jung, confused him, taught him, and through the dialogue with them, his understanding of the psyche deepened immeasurably. The process of individuation, Jung emphasized, has no end point in this life. One does not achieve the self. One enters into relationship with it, allowing it to guide the ongoing process of becoming. The work is asymptotic, always approaching but never fully arriving. And because the self contains everything, light and shadow, integration includes acknowledging one's darkness, one's capacity for harm, one's participation in the collective shadow of humanity. There is no individuation without moral confrontation, without taking responsibility for one's own evil as well as one's good. Assagioli's psychosynthesis, while it shares individuation's goal of wholeness, proceeds from different premises and through different means. Psychosynthesis is more structured, more progressive, more amenable to systematic teaching than Jung's approach. Assagioli outlined distinct stages: personal psychosynthesis, the integration of the personality around the conscious self, and transpersonal psychosynthesis, the alignment of the personality with the higher self. Personal psychosynthesis begins with a thorough exploration of the personality, mapping the landscape of subpersonalities, understanding their origins, needs, and conflicts. A person might discover a perfectionist subpersonality that drives them relentlessly, a rebel that resists authority, a pleaser that sacrifices authentic needs for approval, a critic that attacks from within. Each of these is not merely a role or a habit, but a semi-autonomous center with its own perspective, emotions, and will. The work is to bring these subpersonalities into awareness, to let them speak, to understand their positive intentions even when their methods are destructive. The perfectionist, for instance, may be trying to protect us from shame or failure. The rebel may be defending our autonomy. The pleaser may be ensuring that we maintain relationships. Once understood, these subpersonalities can be invited into dialogue. Their energies can be appreciated and redirected, and they can begin to cooperate rather than compete. This is done from the vantage point of the conscious self, the observing I that is not identified with any subpersonality. Establishing this center of awareness through practices of disidentification is foundational to psychosynthesis. I have emotions, but I am not my emotions. I have thoughts, but I am not my thoughts. This simple practice, repeated and deepened, creates a space of freedom, a place to stand that is not swept away by the tides of feeling or the storms of thought. From this center, one can begin to exercise the will, not as forceful control, but as skillful direction. Assagioli distinguished between the will that represses and the will that directs energy toward chosen goals. The latter requires knowing what one truly values, what one is called to do and become. This is where the connection to the higher self becomes crucial, because the higher self is the source of one's deepest values, one's authentic calling. Transpersonal psychosynthesis involves practices designed to open one to the superconscious and to bring its qualities into lived experience. Assagioli developed a wide array of such practices, guided ascents to inner temples of wisdom, meditations on the rose or the mountain or the sun as symbols of spiritual realities, visualizations in which one invokes and embodies qualities like courage, serenity, or love, exercises in which one imagines oneself from the perspective of the higher self, seeing one's life and problems from a higher vantage point. These practices are not mere imagination in the sense of making things up. Assagioli believed, as did Jung, that imagination is a faculty through which real, psychological, and spiritual realities can be contacted. When one visualizes ascending a mountain and meeting a wise being at the summit, one is not creating a fiction but using the imagination as an organ of perception to contact the superconscious, to access wisdom that is not available to ordinary discursive thinking. The difference from Jung's active imagination is one of directionality and intent. In active imagination, one waits to see who or what appears, follows the unconscious lead, allows the symbols to unfold without predetermining where they will go. In psychosynthetic guided visualization, one consciously constructs a symbolic scenario designed to invoke a particular quality or contact a particular dimension of consciousness. Both methods access the imaginal realm, but one is more receptive, the other more intentional. Assagioli also emphasized techniques for working directly with energy in the body and psyche. He taught exercises for grounding, centering, and balancing, for invoking and radiating love or other qualities, for visualizing light filling the body and extending outward. These practices have parallels in Eastern traditions, like yoga and qigong, and Assagioli integrated them into a Western psychological framework. The goal of psychosynthesis, ultimately, is what Assagioli called self-realization, a state in which the personality is harmonized, the higher self is consciously known and expressed, and one lives with purpose, creativity, and contribution to the greater good. This is not a static achievement, but an ongoing process, a way of being in which one remains open to higher inspiration while grounded in effective action in the world. Where Jung emphasized the importance of staying connected to the earth, to the body, to the concrete realities of life, even as one explores the heights and depths of psyche, Assagioli emphasized the importance of bringing spiritual realization into practical expression. He spoke of beauty in action, of making one's life a work of art, of service motivated by love rather than duty. He was concerned that spiritual development not become an escape from the world, but a preparation for more conscious and compassionate engagement with it. This emphasis on service and contribution is less explicit in Jung's work, though it is certainly present. Jung's focus was more on the individual's relationship to the self, trusting that a person who has undergone individuation will naturally contribute to the collective in meaningful ways, though perhaps not in conventionally recognized forms. Assagioli was more explicitly concerned with social transformation, believing that as individuals undergo psychosynthesis, they become agents of positive change in their families, organizations, and societies. The two approaches also differ in their accessibility. Jung's depth psychology requires considerable intellectual sophistication and psychological mindedness. One needs to be comfortable with ambiguity, paradox, and symbolic thinking. One needs patience for the slow unfolding of the unconscious messages. It is not a method that can be quickly learned or easily taught. It requires a certain temperament, introverted, reflective, willing to live with uncertainty. Psychosynthesis, by contrast, was designed to be teachable and applicable across a wide range of contexts. Assagioli trained teachers and therapists in psychosynthetic methods, developed curricula, wrote exercises, and guided meditations that could be used by people without years of training. This accessibility is both a strength and a potential weakness. It makes the approach available to many people who would never undertake Jungian analysis, but it can also lead to superficial application, to using techniques without understanding the depth of the psyche with which one is working. As we consider these two approaches, these two maps of consciousness, it becomes clear that they are not ultimately opposed, but complementary, two movements in a larger dance. Consciousness is vast, containing depths and heights, darkness and light, autonomous processes and the capacity for intentional direction. We need maps that honor this vastness, methods that can work with different dimensions, teachers who can guide us in both descent and ascent. In the lived experience of the person on the path, there are times when Jung's approach is exactly what is needed. When dreams become insistent, when symptoms arise that will not be quieted, when the shadow demands recognition, when one is in the midst of a life transition and needs to listen to what the unconscious is saying in these times, the receptive, exploratory, depth-oriented approach serves the soul's need. To rush through such periods, to try to transcend them prematurely, to impose will or reach for the light, would be to miss the gift the darkness offers. And there are times when Assagioli's approach is exactly what is needed. When one is scattered and needs to find one's center, when subpersonalities are in conflict and need to be harmonized, when one has done the shadow work and is ready to cultivate higher consciousness, when one needs practices to stabilize insights and embody values in these times, the more active, intentional, synthesis-oriented approach serves the soul's need. To remain always in receptivity, to always wait for the unconscious, to never actively invoke and embody higher qualities, would be to miss the call to conscious participation in one's own becoming. The wise practitioner, whether working with oneself or others, will draw on both traditions, sensing which approach is called for in a given moment. Sometimes we need to descend before we can ascend. Sometimes we need to ascend in order to gain the perspective and strength necessary to descend. The spiral of development moves through both directions, and the path to wholeness requires both the humility to receive what the unconscious offers and the will to reach toward what the higher self calls us to become. In considering the legacy of these two men, we must acknowledge that neither had the final word on consciousness. The territory they were mapping is infinite, and every map is partial. Jung himself said that his psychology was his myth, the way his psyche expressed itself, and should not be taken as universal truth. Assagioli, too, saw psychosynthesis as a growing, evolving body of knowledge, not a closed system. Since their time, psychology has expanded in many directions. Neuroscience has revealed the brain's staggering complexity and has begun to identify neural correlates of states of consciousness. Developmental psychology has mapped stages of cognitive, moral, and self-development. Trauma studies have shown how overwhelming experiences fragment the psyche and how healing occurs through reintegration. Somatic psychology has explored how the body holds memory and meaning. Contemplative science has begun to study meditation and other spiritual practices with rigorous methodologies. Systems theory has shown how consciousness is embedded in larger systems, family, culture, ecology. Yet for all these advances, the essential questions Jung and Assagioli grappled with remain. What is consciousness? What is the relationship between the individual and the universal? How do we heal the splits within ourselves and between ourselves and others? How do we access the wisdom and creativity latent in the psyche? How do we live meaningful lives? How do we understand and integrate experiences of transcendence, the moments when we touch something larger than ourselves? These questions cannot be answered by neuroscience alone, or by behavioral psychology, or by any purely empirical approach, because they are questions about meaning, value, and subjective experience. They require the kind of inward-turning attention, the patient exploration of the inner world that both Jung and Assagioli devoted their lives to. In our current cultural moment, there is a resurgence of interest in consciousness, in spiritual practices, in depth psychology. People are recognizing that the purely materialist worldview leaves something essential out, that we cannot reduce human beings to mechanisms without losing what is most human. There is hunger for meaning, for practices that connect us to deeper dimensions of being, for psychologies that honor the soul. At the same time, there is danger of superficiality, of spiritual materialism, of using practices and concepts as commodities to be consumed rather than as paths to be walked. The market offers endless products promising transformation, enlightenment, wellness, optimization. It is easy to collect techniques the way one collects possessions, to accumulate spiritual experiences without integrating them, to use the language of higher consciousness as a badge of identity rather than a description of hard-won insight. Both Jung and Assagioli would caution against this. For Jung, the work is difficult, often dark, requiring sacrifice and moral courage. There are no shortcuts. The treasure is guarded by dragons. For Assagioli, while the superconscious is accessible and its treasures available, the work of synthesis requires sustained discipline, the training of will, the patient harmonization of the personality. Spiritual experiences may come as grace, but their integration requires effort. Perhaps what we most need from these two thinkers is their seriousness, the recognition that psychological and spiritual work is the central task of a human life, not a hobby or a technique for stress relief. Both men gave their lives to exploring consciousness. Both underwent deep inner work. Both were willing to be changed by what they discovered. Both recognized that the psyche is a mystery that can be explored but never fully explained, a depth that can be sounded but never exhausted. In honoring both, in holding their approaches in dialogue, we honor the full spectrum of human consciousness. We acknowledge that we are beings suspended between earth and heaven, darkness and light, instinct and spirit. We need roots in the depths and wings toward the heights. We need to integrate the shadow and invoke the light. We need the slow, patient work of making the unconscious conscious and the intentional practice of aligning with our highest potentials. The conversation between Jung and Assagioli continues in the work of contemporary teachers and therapists, in the practices of seekers, in the evolution of consciousness itself. As we become more aware of the structures and processes of our own minds, as we learn to navigate the inner landscape with greater skill, as we contact the depths of the unconscious and the heights of the superconscious, we are participating in the ongoing human project of self-knowledge and self-realization. This project is both individual and collective. As individuals undertake the work of individuation and psychosynthesis, they contribute to the evolution of collective consciousness. The archetypes themselves may evolve, as Jung suggested, through being made conscious in individual lives. The superconscious becomes more accessible as more people learn to contact it. The wounds that repeat generation after generation can be healed as individuals take responsibility for their own healing. The potentials that sleep in humanity can be awakened as individuals commit to their own awakening. In this sense, psychological and spiritual work is not selfish, but is perhaps the most generous thing one can do. By becoming more conscious, more whole, more aligned with the deepest truth of one's being, one serves not only oneself, but all beings. One becomes a clearer channel for the creative and healing energies of the psyche. One contributes to the field of consciousness that we all share. Jung's late work explored synchronicity, the causal connecting principle that suggests that mind and matter, inner and outer, are not ultimately separate, but are two aspects of an underlying unity. When we are aligned with the self, when we are living from our deepest center, synchronicities increase. The outer world seems to conspire to support our journey. This is not magic, but is the natural result of being in harmony with the deeper patterns of reality. Assagioli, too, recognized that as one aligns with the higher self, life flows more easily. Obstacles that once seemed insurmountable dissolve. Resources appear. One is guided by intuition and inspiration. This is not because the higher self is powerful in an egoic sense, but because it is in tune with the larger whole, with the unfolding of life itself. Both men pointed toward a way of being in which ego and self, personality and transpersonal center are in right relationship. The ego does not disappear but finds its proper place as the executive function of the personality, carrying out the intentions of the self, serving something larger than itself. This is what Jung called the ego-self axis, the vital connection between consciousness and its ground. This is what Assagioli described as the personality becoming the instrument of the higher self. In this state, one experiences a paradoxical freedom. One is no longer driven by compulsion or addiction, no longer tossed about by every emotion or circumstance, yet one is also not rigidly controlling or willful. There is a quality of flow, of spontaneity within structure, of action arising from depth rather than from surface reactivity. One knows one's values and purpose, yet one remains open to the moment, responsive to what life brings. This is not a permanent state, but a quality of being that can be accessed more and more frequently as the work deepens. There will still be times of darkness, confusion, suffering, but one has resources to draw on, practices to return to, a sense of connection to something that endures through all changes. As we near the end of this long meditation on Jung and Assagioli, on depth and height, on the vast territory of human consciousness, let us rest in the recognition that this conversation has no end. Every human being is a unique experiment in consciousness, a distinctive way that the universe comes to know itself. Every life is a journey through the inner landscape, encountering shadows and lights, challenges and graces, moments of despair and moments of transcendence. Jung and Assagioli were pioneers, cartographers who mapped regions of consciousness that the mainstream of their time ignored or denied. They made it possible for us to speak of the unconscious, the archetypes, the self, the superconscious, the higher self, without apology, recognizing these as real dimensions of experience, not mere poetic metaphors. They gave us methods, practices, languages with which to engage these dimensions. But the real work is always our own. No one can do our inner work for us. No one can face our shadow for us, or make the connection to our higher self for us, or undergo the process of individuation or psychosynthesis on our behalf. We each must walk the path ourselves, stumbling and learning, dying and being reborn, slowly, sometimes painfully, sometimes joyfully, becoming who we are. The gift these two men offer us is permission and guidance, permission to take the inner life seriously, to honor spiritual experience, to believe that consciousness is not a fluke or an illusion, but is fundamental to reality, and guidance in the form of maps and methods, stories and concepts, practices and insights that can light our way. In the end, the dialogue between Jung and Assagioli points beyond itself to the living reality of consciousness exploring itself. Every time we pause to reflect on a dream, every time we sit in meditation, every time we choose to act from our deepest values rather than from reactivity, every time we face a difficult truth about ourselves, every time we open to a moment of beauty or connection or love in all these moments, we are participating in the great work that Jung and Assagioli devoted their lives to, the work of becoming conscious, of becoming whole, of becoming fully human. May their legacy inspire us to continue this work in our own unique ways, with patience and courage, with humility and aspiration, descending into depth and ascending toward height, honoring both the darkness and the light until the fragmentary self we take ourselves to be opens to the larger self we are, until the isolated consciousness we experience expands to recognize its participation in universal consciousness, until we come home to who we have always been beneath all the forgetting and becoming. The path continues, through the night and into the dawn, through shadow and into light, through the wilderness of the unconscious and toward the clarity of the superconscious, step by step, breath by breath, dream by dream, practice by practice, until the journey and the destination are recognized as one, until the seeker and the sought are known to be the same. Rest now, wanderer, in the space between waking and dreaming, knowing that consciousness is vast, that you are part of something larger, that the work of becoming yourself is also the work of returning to what you have always been. Let the voices of Jung and Assagioli, speaking across time, remind you that you are both human and divine, both limited and infinite, both darkness and light, and that the journey toward wholeness is the greatest adventure a soul can undertake. The dialogue continues. The exploration deepens. The mystery remains and invites us ever onward, ever inward, ever upward, ever home.